Hello, today I'm going to walk through my dissertation problem of practice, understanding drivers of technical debt by factors that cause reduction to innovation within the United States Department of Veteran Affairs, a mixed methods exploratory sequential study. So let's start out by talking about what is technical debt. Most often when technical debt is talked about, it's talked about in terms of I can't get something done because of technical debt. And the underlying reasons of what those might be are difficult to understand. In this particular picture, you can see that it looks like this house has had a number of projects, had some pillars, had an umbrella, and the reason why the window can't go in isn't attributable to any one of those, but a combination of those multiple reasons. And the idea of technical debt is that there are multiple factors that contribute to the balance of things that we need to go fix in order to continue to innovate and deliver quality services. This term was first coined by Ward Cunningham, one of the signers of the Agile Manifesto, and he talked about technical debt as the construct of borrowing against a future date. So choosing not to fix a defect today means you're going to pay interest in terms of support tickets, or choosing not to go and replace a failing server today means you're going to pay for it in labor hours and failing services in the future. This has been expanded over the last 30 years to encompass a number of areas. And I decided to explore some of those areas at the Department of Veteran Affairs. In my study, I had 3 research questions. I had a qualitative research question that really dug into those core beliefs that the technologists, so the people actually running the technology at the VA, had about technical debt. My second question touched on the quantitative portion, so looking at their experiences, what did the institutional data sources show me? And then putting those together, figuring out if their observations about issues that they believed contributed to technical debt matched institutional data sources. Putting those two together gave me a mixed methods answer. My literature review was broken into 2 main areas. I tried to focus on technical debt from a culture lens, since technical debt comes from culture and the decision to allow technical debt to come in or not to allow technical debt to come in. That broke into 2 main areas: core beliefs and processes and practices. Core beliefs are things that people believe about technical debt and how it should be used. Processes and practices are the areas of technical debt that exist. As far as the literature on technical debt, from a processes and practice standpoint, it broke down into norms of behavior, processes, systems, and practices. And I ended up ultimately picking a single framework that aggregated all of them together, which we'll talk about a little bit later. On the core belief side, we talked about shared values, state, people's beliefs, and attitudes. And I'll explain a little bit more of what those were in the core beliefs section. So in the core beliefs section, after going through several hundred articles, they boiled down into 5 core beliefs about technical debt. The first core belief is that technical debt arises due to a lack of investment. So this is there's not enough money, and that's why technical debt exists. It's the one most commonly found in kind of newspaper articles and from executive correspondence when talking about technical debt. The second is that technical debt is a byproduct of internal cultural drivers. This one talks about things like a culture that doesn't do process optimization or is highly siloed. Technical debt exists because there's a culture that doesn't allow it to be remediated. It's the idea behind this core belief. The third is that technical debt is a strategic tool. This seemed most prevalent in startups and small companies that were attempting to deliver minimum viable products and accepting technical debt because they didn't have the funding to go and remediate it. The fourth is that technical debt is a disease that destroys companies. We see this a lot in larger companies that have large amounts of technical debt and can't compete with smaller companies. And the fifth is that technical debt is hidden. And the belief here is that technical debt exists not because conscious decisions are made, but because it's out of sight and thus out of mind. To explore kind of the areas of technical debt, I leveraged a model from Alves. A number of Brazilian researchers got together and they aggregated all the different areas that are representative of technical debt. And in these areas, things like process debt and infrastructure debt, build debt, are representative of what we saw in kind of that processes and practices area. So you'll note the change from the literature review of processes and practices to area of technical debt to align with this framework. As I went through evaluating this study, I started off with my qualitative portion. You saw that from that first research question. My procedure there is I executed semi-structured interviews, and I coded the data from those interviews. Now that coding, don't think of it like programming. That's coding as in I took themes and data that I gathered from the interviews and put them into groups. And then that built to the idea of finding one common theme throughout all the interviews that I could go analyze quantitatively. And for that, I decided to go look at the Viper data. There are dozens of processes that contribute to technical debt, but all of the teams had experience with Viper and gave me information on their difficulties with the process. And I tested that by doing statistical inference on the Viper data sets, specifically on intake, did some box and whiskers charts and things to that effect that if you decide to read my dissertation, you'll be able to look through. To give kind of an idea of the size of the study, I interviewed 24 teams in a focus group setting with 127 individuals. That's as part of that semi-structured interviews. When I was looking at the Viper data, I looked at 682 active records and then 863 total records. The difference between the two is there are records that are Viper records that are put on hold that are still actively being followed up on, even though they're not marked as active anymore. So walking through the results section, the first portion of the results is around core beliefs. In this chart on the y-axis here, you can see the frequency of core beliefs. You'll see that the most common core belief is that technical debt is hidden. This was the core belief that talked about technical debt exists and persists because it's hidden and thus out of sight, out of mind. The second most common core belief from my participants in the study was that technical debt at the VA is a byproduct of internal cultural drivers, especially process drivers. The next was the areas of technical debt. In this portion of the study, the top two areas ended up being documentation debt and process debt. So this documentation debt dealt a lot with not understanding what systems exist where, not having a full CMDB, not being able to understand all the systems and how they integrate together. And because we don't understand how they integrate together, the elephant is too big to go consume and go remediate. And then the second was process debt. Pretty close between the two, but process debt talked about how the processes of the VA, things like colors of money and understanding how to facilitate intake, are really the reasons that technical debt doesn't get remediated. Walking through the integration portion of the study, you'll see we had that qualitative finding 1, that technical debt persists because it's hidden. That ties with that first core belief. And the qualitative finding 2, that the most prevalent areas were technical debt and documentation debt. The quantitative results showed that it took more than 30 days to get a Viper followed up on and over a year to get a Viper completed. The mixed methods finding between the two basically said that, hey, technical debt does indeed persist because it is hidden, and the cultural practices, specifically the processes and lack of documentation, contribute to the hidden nature of technical debt. Thus, the observations from the participants and the data and the supporting processes are congruous. As far as the recommendations to go resolve some of these areas that I found, the first recommendation is to close the documentation gap. So we need to make sure that we're looking at two pieces. First, we need to have a systematic approach so we can find the large number of configuration items or CIs very quickly. So investing in an AI ops approach, an artificial intelligence operations approach, to gather that data is important. It's important to understand also that while there are a lot of great AI ops tools out there, there's still going to be some human intervention required to go assign human owners, stewards for the applications, identify dependencies. Those things need to happen as the phase 1. So the first recommendation is close that documentation gap. It's also important to understand that a lot of work being done as favors is used to kind of subvert those process deficiencies that we talked about in the areas of technical debt, and those need to be shut down because they add to the documentation gap of things that are done within systems. The second recommendation is to create navigational capital as a stopgap. So today it is possible to get something through all of the VA processes, but a very small number of people can actually do it. So the idea of having someone to help navigate through the process is going to be super important as we do all the process engineering work to go remediate these multiple intake processes that exist. The third recommendation is to facilitate the appropriate use of VA funds. This is one of the ones that came up pretty frequently. A number of teams mentioned that they had millions of dollars that they had to give back every year because they could not figure out how to go use their dollars. This may be a little different from folks outside of the government, but the idea that certain funds are only able to be used for certain portions of projects, unless they're channeled or funneled a certain way, is a hard concept for technologists coming into the government, and even long-term people who have been in the government for a long time to understand. So finding someone who can help people understand which buckets of money can be used for which things to reduce the delays of projects will substantially improve the remediation of technical debt. So it's not a lack of funding, but rather a lack of the ability to use the funding. Those are my recommendations for those of you who are coming to the defense on September 15th at 2 p.m. Central. I look forward to seeing you then. Thank you.